The forest had always been my refuge, a place where I could retreat from the noise of everyday life and find a kind of quiet clarity. I'd spent years camping alone, most of it uneventful, occasionally touching on the strange but never outright terrifying. So when I planned a solo trip to the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania, I was expecting the usual solitude and peace, maybe a few moments of unease, but nothing more. The day I left, the sun was bright and the air cool, just early fall, with the leaves starting to turn a rich amber and gold. I packed my gear carefully, wanting to travel light but prepared. A tent, sleeping bag, some dehydrated meals, water filter, a small stove, a flashlight, and my trusty pocket knife. My phone was mostly for pictures and emergency calls, though I knew the signal would be spotty. The drive into the forest was long, and by the time I reached the dirt parking area at the trailhead, the sun was hanging low. I strapped on my pack and set off on the trail marked on the map the ranger had given me, a little-known route that cut deep into the forest, away from any established campsites or other hikers. The trail was narrow and rocky, twisting between ancient oaks and thick underbrush. After about an hour, I found the small clearing by a quiet stream the ranger had mentioned. It was the perfect spot, flat, sheltered, and peaceful. I set up my tent, collected some firewood, and started a small fire. As night fell, I felt that familiar calm, the kind that settles into your bones when you're truly alone in the wilderness. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some dinner, listened to the creek's soft rush, and watched the stars emerge in the black sky. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in my sleeping bag, but sometime around 1:30 a.m., I woke. At first, I thought I was dreaming. There was a faint tapping coming from just outside my tent, slow, deliberate, like fingertips drumming lightly on wood. I sat up, heart pounding. The air around me was still, no breeze, nothing that should have caused the sound. I unzipped and zipped the tent flap a little and shone my flashlight into the dark. The beam caught on the trunk of a tree near my tent, but nothing moved. I called out softly, "Hello," but only the quiet creek responded. I told myself it was probably a branch tapping against the tent, maybe knocked loose by a small animal, but the rhythm felt unnatural. The tapping stopped after a few minutes, replaced by a silence that felt heavy. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come. When dawn broke, I climbed out of the tent and walked to the stream to wash my face. The forest looked innocent enough in the daylight, the morning mist still clinging to the undergrowth. That afternoon, I hiked a little upstream, following the creek, taking pictures of the moss-covered stones and the occasional squirrel darting through the leaves. But as I walked, I noticed the silence. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing. The forest felt empty, as if it was holding its breath. Back at camp, I found something strange. Just beyond my fire ring was a small pile of stones stacked in a perfect tower, about 6 inches high. I hadn't left them there. I looked around for footprints or signs of other visitors, but the ground was undisturbed. I felt a prickle of unease, but shrugged it off as a prank by some other camper. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. It wasn't on the tree this time. It was coming from the brush just beyond the firelight. And this time, I heard whispers, barely audible, like voices just beyond comprehension. I sat still by the fire, watching the darkness. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement. A tall, thin figure stepping behind a tree, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I swung the beam around quickly, but there was nothing there. My breath came faster, cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I decided to pack up first thing in the morning, but the forest had other plans. When I tried to follow the trail back to my car, the path seemed different. Trees were spaced oddly, and landmarks I'd noted earlier were gone or shifted. My compass spun wildly, useless. I was lost. Panic began to set in. I wandered, calling out, hoping to hear a response or see another hiker. Instead, the tapping began again, this time all around me, coming from multiple directions. The whispers grew louder, urgent, though still impossible to understand. Then I heard breathing, heavy and labored, close behind me. I spun around, knife drawn, but only saw darkness. Exhausted and terrified, I stumbled into a small clearing. In the center was an old wooden chair, worn and weathered, facing away from me. On the seat lay another pile of stones, arranged just like the one at my campsite. The whispers stopped abruptly. The air turned ice cold. I felt a weight settle over my chest. I took a step forward and the chair slowly turned on its own, revealing a pale, expressionless face staring straight at me. The eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck the light from the clearing. Frozen in place, I barely managed to scream before everything around me dissolved into silence. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the forest floor near the edge of the trail. My pack was torn open, my flashlight dead. The sun was high, and distant voices called my name. I staggered back to my car without looking back. Since then, the tapping and whispering haunt me in my dreams. Sometimes I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that chair and the empty eyes waiting. I haven't gone back to the Allegheny Forest since, and I don't plan to. Some parts of the wilderness are meant to stay unexplored, some silence better left unbroken. Story the end. The plan was simple. A solo camping trip in the woods where cell phones lost signal, and the only company would be the whispering trees and the crackling fire. I was craving solitude, a chance to clear my mind and reconnect with nature after months of city noise and work stress. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, flashlight, and my journal. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just that I'd be off the grid for a few days. I arrived mid-afternoon at the trailhead just before the last car left. The parking lot was deserted, except for a weather-beaten sign that warned of unpredictable weather and advised caution. The forest was dense, dark with towering pines whose tops disappeared into a gray sky. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin, fresh but a little ominous. I set off with a light pack, following a narrow trail that wound steadily upward. About 2 hours in, the path grew rougher. I scrambled over rocks and tangled roots, losing cell signal completely. The only sound was the occasional snap of a twig underfoot and the rhythmic creak of trees swaying in a breeze that seemed colder and quieter than expected. My watch said early evening, but the light was fading fast under the thick canopy. I needed to find a campsite soon. I stumbled upon a small clearing near a slow-moving stream, a perfect spot. I set up my tent on a patch of dry ground, gathered wood for a fire, and brewed some instant coffee. The cold seeped into my bones despite the layers I wore. As the sun dipped below the treetops, the shadows stretched long and strange shapes seemed to flicker just beyond the edges of my campfire's glow. The night settled quickly, and with it came a silence deeper than any I'd ever known. No bird song, no rustling animals, just an oppressive stillness that felt less like peace and more like waiting. I pulled out my journal and tried to write, but my hand shook and the words blurred on the page. Around midnight, something stirred. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, rustling through the underbrush near the stream. Then I heard a faint, irregular tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. It came from the edge of the clearing, just beyond my firelight. The sound was slow, deliberate, and chillingly close. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam toward the noise. Nothing, just dark trees and shadows. Then, just as I lowered the light, a whisper floated through the cold air. It was a woman's voice, barely audible, almost pleading. "Help me!" I froze. The fire sputtered, sending embers spiraling into the night. The whisper came again. "Help me?" My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw her, a pale figure standing just beyond the firelight. She was thin, her hair hanging in damp strands around her face. Her eyes were hollow and dark, fixed on me. I blinked, and she was gone. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and pulled the sleeping bag tight around me, trying to block out the cold and the fear. Sleep wouldn't come. In the early hours, the tapping returned, this time on the tent fabric, light, slow, measured. Then the whisper, louder, more urgent. "Please." Morning couldn't come soon enough. When the first light filtered through the trees, the fog that had crept in overnight clung thickly to the forest floor, twisting around trunks like ghostly fingers. I packed quickly, the weight of dread heavier than my backpack. As I retraced my steps, I noticed strange symbols carved into the bark of several trees along the trail. Circles intersected with lines, shapes that made no sense to me. They looked old, but fresh sap oozed from some of the carvings. My skin crawled. The trail led me to an old, dilapidated cabin hidden deep in the woods. The door hung open, creaking softly in the breeze. I didn't want to enter, but something pushed me forward. Inside, the air was thick with decay and something else, something cold and unwelcoming. On a dusty table lay a faded photograph of a woman. Her eyes were hauntingly familiar. I realized with a shudder that she was the same woman I'd seen the night before. Suddenly, the whisper returned, filling the cabin. "Find me." I fled back into the forest, my breath ragged and fast. The woods closed around me like a cage. I didn't stop until I burst out onto the main road, heart still pounding, lungs burning. I never went back to that forest. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that tapping at the window and the faint whisper, "Help me." Story the end. The idea of going solo camping had always held a certain appeal to me. It was about solitude, a break from the chaos of everyday life, a chance to find peace deep within nature's embrace. I'd been an avid hiker and camper for years, but this time I wanted to push myself farther, deeper into a remote patch of forest that few people ventured into. The Appalachian Mountains had always drawn me with their dense woods and rolling hills, and I chose a lesser-known area tucked away from popular trails. I left the city early one crisp October morning, driving for hours until the asphalt gave way to gravel and then dirt. The last mile was rough, and I had to park my car at a small clearing by an old logging road. My pack was heavy but well organized. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water purifier, and the usual essentials. I checked my map again, a faded topographical print I'd found at the ranger station, then headed into the trees. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and thick moss. I kept my pace steady, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot the only sound besides occasional birdsong. After about an hour, I reached a narrow stream cutting through the forest floor. The sun was high, filtering through the canopy in patches of gold. I followed the stream uphill until I found a small clearing sheltered by towering oaks and maples. It was quiet here, too quiet in a way that settled heavy in my chest. The clearing was perfect for a campsite, flat and dry, with a nearby rock outcrop I could use as a windbreak. I set up my tent quickly, my hands working on autopilot, then gathered firewood. As the sun lowered and shadows stretched long, I lit a fire. Flames flickered, casting dancing patterns on the trees. I boiled water, ate a simple meal, and sat back against a log, breathing in the cool evening air. Night came fast, bringing with it an unsettling silence. Usually the forest buzzed with insects and the calls of nocturnal animals, but here there was nothing. The air was still, and the darkness seemed to press in around me. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching leaves just beyond the firelight. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam into the darkness, but saw nothing. The footsteps circled the clearing, steady and unhurried. I called out, voice barely above a whisper, "Hello?" No response. The sound stopped. Then a faint whispering, too soft to make out words, but close enough that my skin prickled. I didn't sleep that night. Morning brought no relief. When I stepped outside the tent, I noticed strange marks in the dirt, footprints, but not like any animal or human. They were oddly shaped, elongated, with deep impressions where toes would be. They formed a loose circle around the clearing. As I packed up, a sudden chill passed through me. I heard a low humming, almost a chant, carried faintly on the breeze from deep within the woods. I turned, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The hike back was nerve-wracking. The forest seemed alive in a way I couldn't explain. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, and the silence was punctuated by distant, indistinct murmurs. When I reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. The experience stayed with me, vivid, real, and disturbing. I researched the area and discovered stories of disappearances, strange lights, and rumors of an old Native American burial ground nearby. I never returned to that forest, but sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear the footsteps again. Slow, pacing, circling just beyond the edge of my consciousness. Story, the end. The decision to go solo camping was spontaneous. After months of nonstop work and city life, I craved silence. Not just the quiet of my apartment, but the kind that only wilderness could offer. I'd been camping before, but always with friends or at crowded sites. This time, I wanted the raw, isolated experience, deep in a forest where cell phones had no signal and the trees seemed endless. I chose a state park tucked away in the northern mountains, known for its dense pines and rugged terrain. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday, parking my car at the trailhead with only a couple of other vehicles scattered around. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, the kind of smell that feels both calming and ancient. My pack was heavy but manageable, stuffed with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 3 days, water, and a headlamp. I set off, following a narrow, winding trail marked with faded yellow blazes. The forest quickly swallowed me. Towering trees blocked the fading sunlight, turning the path dimmer with each step. The ground was soft beneath my boots, carpeted with needles and moss, muffling my footsteps. After about 3 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a babbling creek. It was perfect. The ground was level and dry, surrounded by thick firs that shielded the site from the wind. I pitched my tent, built a small fire ring with gathered stones, and set about making a simple dinner of instant soup and trail mix. As darkness deepened, the forest grew unnervingly silent. No bird song, no rustling small creatures. Even the creek's gentle burble seemed muted, as if the night had swallowed every sound whole. I sat by the fire, the flames flickering shadows against the trees, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Around 11 p.m., I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and switched on my headlamp for some light reading. My eyes kept darting to the tent wall, or rather to the shadow cast on it by the flickering fire. Then I heard it, faint footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. Not the random scurry of an animal, but measured, almost human. I unzipped the tent flap carefully and peeked outside. The fire had mostly died down to glowing embers, the night thick with fog that had rolled in silently. Nothing moved in the clearing, but the footprints told a different story. There were fresh prints in the soft earth just outside the fire ring, bare feet, small and oddly shaped, leading away from camp into the dark woods. My heart hammered in my chest. I called out softly, "Hello? Who's there?" No reply. The forest was too still to swallow sound. I would have heard something. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam only caught glimpses of twisted branches and wet leaves. Then I thought I saw a figure, white, indistinct, standing just beyond the tree line. I blinked, and it vanished. The rest of the night passed in a haze of uneasy sleep and restless tossing. Every little noise, a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, made me flinch. In the early hours, I thought I heard whispering, too soft to catch words, but unmistakably human. My mind told me it was the wind, but a deeper part of me knew otherwise. Morning brought no relief. The fog lingered thick, wrapping the forest like a shroud. When I stepped outside, the footprints from the night before were gone, as if they had never existed. Instead, I found something else. Strange symbols, carved into several trees around the clearing. Circles with lines and angles I didn't recognize, etched deeply and fresh, bleeding sap that looked like dark blood against the pale bark. The symbols made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore them and focused on packing up, but the forest felt heavier, almost watchful. As I followed the trail back toward the parking lot, I couldn't shake the sensation that unseen eyes were tracking me. Halfway down the path, I stumbled upon an old, crumbling cabin hidden among the trees. It was out of place, too dilapidated for any current use, almost like a relic forgotten by time. Curiosity pulled me closer. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust motes floated in the weak light filtering through broken windows. On a wooden table lay a tattered journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I picked it up, my fingers trembling slightly. The handwriting inside was neat but hurried, dated almost 40 years ago. The entries described a woman named Lila who'd come to the forest seeking solitude, much like me. But her writing grew frantic with each page. She spoke of voices whispering in the night, shadows that moved on their own, and strange figures watching her from the trees. She wrote of carvings appearing on the trees, symbols that no one else seemed to see. Her last entry was barely legible, ending abruptly with the words, "They're here. I can't leave. Help me." A chill ran down my spine as the whispers returned, this time unmistakably close, almost inside my head. I dropped the journal and bolted from the cabin, heart pounding. I made it back to my car without incident, but felt the forest's weight still pressing on me. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. The images of those symbols, the pale figure in the fog, and Lila's desperate words haunted me. Over the following weeks, I researched the area, uncovering local legends of disappearances and ghost sightings tied to that very patch of forest. Hikers reported hearing voices calling their names, footsteps when no one was there, and finding those strange carvings. Some believed it was the restless spirit of Lila, trapped between worlds. I never returned to that forest, but sometimes when the wind howls just right, I swear I hear faint whispers carried on the breeze, begging for help from a place where the fog never lifts. Story the end. The forest was calling me long before I ever arrived. I can't explain why exactly. Some vague pull, a restless whisper beneath the noise of the city. I'd been camping before plenty of times, but always with friends or family. This time, I wanted something different, to be utterly alone, away from cell signals and roads, deep into a stretch of wilderness where I was the only living soul for miles. I picked a place I'd never been before, a patch of dense woods in the northern part of the Appalachian Range. The ranger who gave me the map had warned me it wasn't a popular spot. Not many people go in there, she said, and those who do don't stay long. That felt like a challenge. I arrived mid-afternoon after a long drive. The last few miles were on a gravel road that quickly narrowed and twisted until I parked where the trees swallowed the trailhead. My pack felt heavy on my back, but I was used to that weight. I double-checked my gear, then stepped onto the trail, the forest immediately closing around me like a wall. The trail was rough and unmaintained, little more than a dirt path littered with roots and fallen branches. I moved steadily, pushing past thorns that snagged my jacket and branches that scraped my face. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birdsong, no rustling animals, just the occasional creak of a tree swaying in the breeze. After nearly 2 hours, I found a clearing beside a slow-moving creek. It was perfect. Flat ground, a natural windbreak formed by ancient oaks, and the soothing sound of running water. I set up my tent quickly, anxious to get the campfire going before nightfall. The fire was a small blaze at first, growing steady and warm as the sun dipped below the horizon. I sat close, watching the flames flicker and listening to the creek's gentle murmur. The forest around me was still, almost unnervingly so. There was a heavy silence I wasn't used to, like the world was holding its breath. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the dark woods just beyond the firelight. It felt like something was watching me, waiting. As the night deepened, I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunching on dry leaves outside the ring of light. My heart hammered in my chest as I grabbed my flashlight and swept it into the shadows. Nothing. I called out softly, "Hello," but the only answer was silence. The footsteps circled the clearing, always just beyond the reach of the beam. Then, a whisper, soft and breathy, floated on the wind. It sounded like a voice calling a name I couldn't quite catch. I zipped my tent closed, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Sleep didn't come. At dawn, I stepped outside and saw the ground was disturbed. Footprints encircling my camp. They were too large and oddly shaped to be human, elongated and with deep indentations like claws rather than toes. I took photos, but they only made the unease grow. I packed up hastily, but as I retraced my steps along the trail, the feeling of being watched never left. Whispering voices brushed past me in the wind, and shadowy figures flickered just beyond my vision. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside, breathless and shaken. That night, back in my apartment, I stared at the photos, convinced I saw faint faces staring from the trees, pale, hollow-eyed, watching. I haven't returned since. Sometimes, when the wind is still and the night is quiet, I swear I hear footsteps circling just outside my window. Story, the end. The forest was dense, darkening quickly as the afternoon slipped away, but I pressed on. I'd planned this solo camping trip for months, eager to escape the noise of the city and find some quiet solitude. The trailhead was miles from the nearest road, tucked into a remote section of the Appalachian wilderness where few ventured. I had my backpack stuffed with gear, a detailed map in my pocket, and the steady beat of my boots against dirt and fallen leaves. The woods were quiet, eerily so. Birds had mostly gone silent, and the usual scurrying of squirrels or rustling in the underbrush was absent. Instead, there was a heavy stillness that seemed to settle around me like a fog. I told myself it was just the time of day, twilight creeping in, animals settling down for the night. But unease had already started to prick at the edges of my mind. By the time I reached the clearing I'd picked for camp, the sky was a slate gray, with the first stars blinking faintly above the canopy. The clearing was small, maybe 40 feet across, ringed by towering pines and oaks. A narrow creek ran along one edge, its water cold and whispering softly over rocks. I set up my tent quickly, my fingers stiff from the cold and the long hike. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. I collected some dry wood for a fire, struck a match, and soon the flames were flickering, casting long shadows that danced and twisted on the trees. The fire was comforting, but beyond its glow, the forest seemed to hold its breath. I ate my simple dinner of trail mix and dehydrated stew, staring into the fire. The silence pressed in on me, the absence of sound more unsettling than any howl or rustle might have been. The wind picked up, rattling branches above, but there was no other movement. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and measured, crunching on dry leaves somewhere just beyond the edge of the firelight. My heart slammed in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it over the trees, but saw nothing. "Hello?" My voice cracked as I called out, but no answer came. The footsteps circled the clearing, always just beyond the light's reach. Then the whispering started. Soft, breathy voices that seemed to rise from the earth itself, speaking words I couldn't understand. My skin prickled with cold despite the fire. I zipped the tent flap closed and lay awake for hours, too afraid to sleep. Every so often, the footsteps would come back, pacing just outside, circling like a predator. At dawn, I unzipped my tent and found the ground around my campsite disturbed. Deep footprints formed a rough circle. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, too large, elongated with claw-like indentations. I took photos, feeling an icy dread crawl through me. I packed up quickly and started back the way I came. The forest seemed alive with shadows moving just beyond my vision. Whispered voices floated on the breeze, and every so often I thought I saw pale faces staring out from the trees, eyes empty and unblinking. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside, my hands trembling. The experience haunted me. I researched the area and discovered rumors of a cursed burial ground nearby, and stories of travelers who vanished without a trace. I haven't returned, but sometimes at night I swear I hear footsteps circling outside my window, slow and deliberate, as if the forest itself is still watching. Story the end. The moment I decided to go camping alone, deep in the mountains, I thought it would be a chance to finally disconnect and clear my mind. I had done solo trips before, but this one was different, farther off the beaten path, more remote. I chose a spot in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, a place where the forest was dense, the terrain rough, and cell phone reception practically non-existent. The plan was simple. Hike in, find a secluded clearing near a creek I had spotted on a topographical map, set up camp, and spend 4 days alone in the wilderness. I told my sister where I was headed and when I'd be back. She was hesitant, reminding me to be careful, but I reassured her. I'd done this many times before. The first day's hike was exhausting but invigorating. The trail was steep and rocky, winding through thick stands of spruce and fir. After about 6 hours, I found the clearing I had been looking for, a small patch of soft earth by a babbling brook, surrounded by towering pines and maples shedding their brilliant autumn leaves. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and made a small campfire. The sun dipped below the ridges, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine was everywhere. I ate dinner, read a few pages of a book, then zipped myself into my sleeping bag, ready for a night under the stars. Sleep didn't come easily. The forest was alive with sounds I had never noticed before. Distant howls, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a faint tapping on the outside of my tent. 3 distinct taps, then a pause, then 2 more. I froze, heart pounding, my breath visible in the chilly air. I whispered, "Hello?" but heard no reply. I unzipped the tent flap cautiously and shone my flashlight outside. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees swaying in the breeze. No animals, no people. Trying to convince myself it was a branch or a curious animal, I zipped the tent back up. Moments later, a low whispering sound started just beyond the tent's fabric. It was unintelligible, as if voices were speaking too softly to hear clearly. My skin prickled. The tapping resumed, this time faster and more urgent. I sat up, clutching my flashlight, eyes wide in the dark. Then the whispering stopped abruptly and the silence returned, heavier and more suffocating than before. The next morning, I found several small piles of stones arranged in strange shapes around the campsite. Circles, triangles, even what looked like crude symbols. I hadn't seen anyone else in days, so I assumed these were from past visitors or maybe animals knocking stones together, but unease settled in my gut. That afternoon, while exploring the woods, I stumbled upon an old campsite, a rusted stove, burned logs, and a faded black and white photo half buried in the dirt. The picture showed a man standing in the very clearing where I'd camped, dated 1952. On the back, someone had written a single word in shaky handwriting: lost. As night fell again, the tapping and whispering returned, louder and more insistent. At one point, I heard footsteps circling the tent, slow and deliberate. I wanted to run, but fear kept me rooted. When I finally unzipped the tent to look, a cold breath brushed my cheek. I spun around, flashlight darting through the darkness. But there was nothing. I packed up early the next morning, my hands shaking. On the trail out, more piles of stones lined the path like markers or warnings. Back home, I researched the area and found a report of a man who had disappeared in those woods in 1952, a solo camper who was never found. I've never camped alone since. Story the end. The summer I turned 32, I decided to take a solo camping trip to the Adirondacks. It wasn't my first time camping alone. I'd been doing solo hikes and overnight trips since I was a teenager. But this trip felt different from the start. I'd recently gone through a breakup and was trying to find some space to clear my head, to be alone with nothing but the trees and my thoughts. I wanted a quiet spot, away from the usual crowded campsites and weekend warriors. After some research, I settled on a remote site near a small, seldom-used trail by a lake called Big Moose Lake. It wasn't far from the road, but the trail was overgrown in places and rarely traveled. The forest there was thick with spruce and fir, and the water was cold and still. I arrived mid-afternoon on a Friday in early August, the air heavy with humidity and the scent of pine needles. The parking lot was empty, which I took as a good sign. After unloading my pack, I started down the trail, following the faint path that twisted through the dense underbrush. The mosquitoes were thick, but I didn't mind. The isolation felt good. About an hour later, I reached the clearing I'd read about on a hiking forum, a small flat area by the water's edge, perfect for a tent. The lake stretched out before me, the surface smooth as glass except for the occasional ripple from a jumping fish. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood for a fire, and pulled out my book. As the sun began to set, I built a small fire. The woods grew darker, the sounds of the forest coming alive, crickets chirping, the distant hoot of an owl, leaves rustling softly in the breeze. I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker, feeling the cool air settle in. That first night, I slept well enough, though I woke once or twice, hearing the faint snap of twigs or the distant splash of something entering the water. Nothing unusual in the woods. Around 2 a.m., though, I woke suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why, but then I heard it, a soft tapping on the side of my tent. Not the usual forest noises, but deliberate, measured, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on fabric. I froze, staring into the darkness beyond the tent wall. The tapping came again, slow and rhythmic, maybe 6 taps in a row. Then a pause, then 6 taps again. I sat up, heart pounding, eyes wide. I tried to peer outside, but my flashlight was in my pack, zipped closed. I told myself it was probably a branch brushing the tent or a small animal. Still, the tapping continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly. The rest of the night was restless. Every now and then I thought I heard whispering, just on the edge of hearing, unintelligible words carried on the breeze. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or my imagination. When morning came, I packed up my gear and took a longer hike, hoping to shake the unease. The forest was alive with birds and insects now. The trail took me past thick ferns and mossy rocks. I saw a few deer bounding away as I approached. When I returned to camp, something was different. Near my fire pit, I found a small pile of stones carefully stacked in a circle, about the size of a coffee mug. I was certain I hadn't left them there. I looked around for any footprints or signs of other campers, but the ground was undisturbed. No tire tracks, no signs of human presence. Unease crept over me, but I chalked it up to the woods playing tricks on me. That night, the tapping started again, this time louder and closer. It wasn't on the tent. It was coming from just beyond the firelight, near the edge of the clearing. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but saw only the dark outline of trees swaying in the wind. The whispers returned, more distinct now. I swear I could hear my name being called softly, a breathy voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I told myself to stay calm. I stayed by the fire, eyes scanning the shadows. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A thin figure standing just at the tree line. It was pale, almost glowing faintly in the moonlight. Its features were indistinct but haunting. I gasped, and the figure vanished. I grabbed my pack and left as quickly as I could, stumbling down the trail in the dark, guided only by my dying flashlight and the fading moonlight. The forest seemed endless and unrecognizable. Every turn led me deeper into the shadows. The tapping followed me, moving from tree to tree, always just out of reach. I felt eyes on my back, unseen watchers slipping between the trees. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled onto a dirt road. My heart thundered as I ran to my car, threw the door open, and locked myself inside. I drove away without looking back. Weeks later, back home, I found something chilling. On my phone, among the pictures I'd taken, was one I didn't remember taking. A blurry image of a pale figure standing by the lake, its face impossible to make out, but its eyes seemed to glow with an unnatural light. I never returned to Big Moose Lake. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear tapping on my bedroom window, slow and rhythmic, just like that night. Story the end. The urge to get away from everything had been building for months. The endless noise of the city, the constant buzz of electronics, the never-ending pressure from work, it was all too much. I needed silence. Complete isolation. So I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep into the Adirondack Mountains. No phone, no internet, just me in the wilderness. I had done my research, picked a spot that was known for its remoteness and natural beauty, the kind of place where few people ventured, especially off-season. I arrived late afternoon, parking my car at a small trailhead that looked like it hadn't seen many visitors recently. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, but manageable. I carried my pack, feeling the weight of my gear, but eager to push deeper into the woods. After nearly 3 hours of hiking, I found a clearing near a small, babbling brook. It was perfect, enough space to set up camp, sheltered by tall pines, with the sound of running water nearby. I pitched my tent quickly, gathering some dry wood for a fire as the light began to fade. That first night was quiet, peaceful almost. The crackling fire, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through the branches. I lay inside my sleeping bag, staring at the dark canopy through the tent's mesh roof, feeling a kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. But sometime after midnight, the calm shattered. I woke to a faint whispering, soft voices carried on the wind, or maybe right outside the tent. I couldn't make out any words, just a murmur that sent chills down my spine. I sat up, heart racing, and listened intently. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then came the tapping. 3 slow knocks, rhythmic, deliberate on the outside of the tent. I held my breath, flashlight trembling in my hand as I unzipped the flap just enough to peer out. Nothing, just the dark forest, shadows shifting between the trees. I whispered, "Who's there?" No reply. The tapping started again, faster this time, and I zipped the tent shut, my hands shaking as I tried to calm down. Sleep was impossible. When dawn came, I emerged cautiously. Around my campsite were strange little piles of stones, arranged in odd patterns I didn't recognize. Small circles and triangles formed near the fire pit and along the creek bank. I shrugged it off, probably left by previous campers or kids playing tricks. But unease lingered. During the day, I explored further. The forest thickened, the trail fading into nothing but tangled undergrowth. As I walked, I noticed odd marks on the trees, deep scratches in the bark, as if made by claws or sharp tools. Later, while sitting by the creek to rest, I thought I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing just beyond the trees, pale and still. I blinked, and it was gone. That night, the whispering returned, louder and more insistent. It seemed to circle my tent, moving closer and then receding. The tapping turned into pounding, like someone beating on a drum. I wanted to run, but felt rooted to the spot, terrified. At one point, I heard footsteps pacing just outside my tent, slow and heavy. When I finally dared to unzip and look, a cold breath brushed my cheek. I spun around, but nothing was there. I packed up at first light, my hands trembling. On the trail back, I found an old weathered sign half buried in the dirt. It read, "Beware the Watcher. Leave before nightfall." I didn't look back. I still don't know what followed me that weekend or what those voices wanted, but I've never camped alone since. Story the end. The summer I turned 31, I decided to take a solo camping trip through the Smoky Mountains. I'd been hiking and camping since I was a teenager, but it had always been with a group. Friends, my brother, once even with a girlfriend. But life had slowed. Friends moved, my brother had a family, and I was craving that old connection with the wilderness. There's something about being alone in the forest that forces you to listen to your thoughts until they start listening back. I started my trip at the Abrams Creek Trailhead, a lesser-used part of the park with primitive campgrounds that didn't get a lot of foot traffic. That was the appeal. Solitude. I was 3 days in when I found a spot well off the trail. It wasn't part of the marked campsites, but I'd seen a game trail leading up a gentle slope into a clearing surrounded by pine and oak. The canopy above was thick, but the clearing had just enough space to pitch my small one-person tent. I remember it clearly. The way the light filtered down through the branches, the sounds of birds calling out across the woods. It felt isolated, but in a safe, beautiful kind of way, like I had stumbled into a pocket of time untouched by anything modern. That first night in the clearing was uneventful. I built a small fire, cooked some rice and beans, and read by headlamp until I got sleepy. Around midnight, I turned in. The forest sounds faded gradually, and sleep came easier than I thought it would. When I woke up the next morning, there was no sign of animals around my camp. No raccoon tracks, no overturned pot looking for food. That was odd. Usually, I'd see at least some trace of critters nosing around. The second night was when things started to get strange. I'd finished another quiet day of hiking nearby and was settling in when I noticed it. Everything had gone silent. At first, I thought maybe I had just adjusted to the background noise and didn't notice it anymore. But it wasn't just quieter. It was dead quiet. No insects, no owls, no wind. Just a heavy, pressing stillness that made me hold my breath without realizing it. That's when I heard the first sound. It came from just beyond the edge of the clearing. A soft crunch like a footfall on dried leaves, not the scurry of a squirrel or the leap of a deer. This was careful, measured, deliberate. I froze. My fire was down to embers, and the darkness outside my headlamp's reach felt endless. I slowly turned the beam toward the edge of the trees, but it didn't catch anything. The sound stopped. I waited a few minutes, straining to hear something, anything. Then another step. Closer this time. Crunch. Then another. Crunch. I called out, trying to sound calm. "Hello?" No answer. The steps stopped. It was the worst kind of silence. Not peaceful or quiet, but the kind that grips your stomach and makes you feel watched. I kept the light trained on the woods for what felt like forever, but eventually I forced myself into the tent and zipped it shut. I left the light on. The rational part of me figured it was probably an animal, maybe even another camper who was trying to make their way to the trail and didn't see my sight. But something didn't feel right. I didn't sleep well. Every time I drifted off, I swore I heard breathing just outside the nylon walls. Not footsteps, not movement, just breathing. Slow, deep, and close. But every time I opened the zipper and flashed my light, there was nothing. When I woke up the next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. A small pile of stones had been carefully arranged at the foot of my tent. 3 flat rocks stacked in a triangle. I hadn't done it. I knew that for certain. I hadn't left the tent since the night before, and I hadn't seen anyone. The stones were clean and dry, like they had been purposefully chosen. I kicked the stack over and packed up camp, figuring I'd head to a more populated part of the trail. I didn't feel alone anymore. Worse, I didn't feel welcome. I made it about 4 miles before I realized something was wrong with my compass. It kept pulling slightly north even when I knew I should be heading east. I pulled out my map, checked landmarks, but everything started to feel off. The terrain didn't match. The ridges didn't line up. I should have hit a creek by then, but I hadn't. There was a moment where I stood in the middle of the forest and realized I couldn't hear water, couldn't see the sun, and couldn't remember the last time I'd seen a trail marker. My stomach dropped. I knew better than to panic, so I sat down, drank some water, and tried to retrace my steps. That's when I saw the same clearing I had camped in 2 nights before. I stopped dead. It was impossible. I had hiked 4 miles in a different direction. The elevation was wrong. The slope of the hill nearby was the reverse of what I remembered, but it was the same clearing, same ring of trees, same game trail leading in. Even the fire pit I had made out of rocks was still there, now filled with cold ash, and in the exact same spot at the base of a tree, another small stack of stones. This time, 5 of them. Taller, tighter, balanced in a way that didn't look natural. I left them alone and backed away. I tried again to leave. I picked a cardinal direction and kept going straight. I broke branches, marked trees, everything I'd been taught. But no matter what direction I went, after a few hours I would circle back, every single time. I started to recognize trees by their scars. A half-broken birch with a rotting base, a hollowed-out stump with moss inside. I passed them over and over again. As the light began to fade, I gave up and returned to the clearing, too tired and scared to keep wandering. I hadn't seen a single sign of life all day. Not a bird, not a chipmunk, just trees, silent and endless. I didn't set up my tent this time. I sat by the fire pit and waited until it was too dark to see. The breathing came back just after midnight. I didn't hear it approach. It was just suddenly there, right behind me, just outside my vision. My neck prickled. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I knew it was watching me. I stayed frozen for almost an hour, too afraid to turn around. My hands trembled in my lap, and the fire had long gone out. The air grew colder than it should have in July. My breath clouded in front of me. I finally snapped and whipped around, shining the light into the trees. Nothing, no movement, no figure, just darkness. But when I turned back to the fire pit, the stones had been restacked, taller, 7 now, each one perfectly balanced. I hadn't heard them being placed. I hadn't moved. That was the last straw. I didn't sleep. I packed at dawn and started walking with no plan. I followed the slope of the hills down, assuming I'd eventually hit a stream or a road. My phone had no signal, but I kept it on, praying something would work. My food was nearly gone, water low, but I kept going. The forest never changed. Still no animals. Still that silence. Like the world had paused. It wasn't until late afternoon that I finally saw something new. A wooden structure, partially hidden behind some trees. It looked ancient. Not a cabin, not a ranger station. It was too small, maybe 8 feet square, with a sagging roof and walls weathered gray. No door, just an opening covered by some hanging animal hide. It looked like something Native American or Appalachian settlers might have built centuries ago. I thought maybe it had supplies or a way to get help. I stepped inside. It was empty, except for one thing. In the center of the floor was a stone altar. Fresh pine needles covered the base and stacked on top, 12 perfectly balanced stones, taller than before, cleaner, as if they'd been placed seconds ago. I heard it again then, breathing, but this time it was inside the structure with me, right behind me. I turned slowly. There was no one there, but I couldn't breathe. My chest locked, eyes welled with panic. I backed out of the building and ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran until I collapsed. That's the last thing I remember clearly. I woke up in a ranger station 2 days later. A group of hikers had found me delirious near the base of the mountain, curled in a hollowed log and dehydrated. I had lost 15 pounds. My gear was intact, but my compass was broken, cracked clean through the glass. The rangers didn't believe me when I told them I'd been stuck looping through the same woods for days. They said I must have gotten disoriented and panicked. I know better. When I asked about the structure I found, they said there was nothing like that in the area. No historical ruins, no hunting cabins. They said I must have imagined it, hallucinated it from exhaustion. But I didn't imagine those stones. A week after I got home, I unpacked my bag and found one sitting in the bottom, a flat, white river rock I'd never collected. It was clean, smooth, and perfectly balanced on its side. I threw it into the creek behind my apartment and moved 6 months later. But sometimes I still dream of the breathing. It always comes from just behind me. I wake up sweating, unable to move, and always, I find a small stack of pebbles outside my window the next morning. Story the end. It was supposed to be a way to clear my head. A week off work, no emails, no noise, just me and the woods. I chose a remote trail in Washington State, one of those lesser-known routes that weren't crowded even in summer. After driving most of the day, I parked my car at a small pull-off near the edge of the trailhead and hiked 5 miles in before setting up camp near a small creek that ran down a slope filled with moss and old-growth trees. The deeper I got, the more the forest seemed to close in around me, not in a menacing way, but heavy with quiet. No cell signal, no bars, no other hikers, just the chirping of birds and the occasional cracking branch from some unseen animal. I pitched my tent in a small clearing beside the creek. The air smelled wet and earthy. It was already getting dim, but I was ready for that. I built a fire, ate a quick dinner from a dehydrated pouch, and read a paperback by lantern light. The quiet made everything feel deeper. Every gust of wind in the trees sounded like breath. But I was tired, and after I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, I drifted off quickly. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning. No sound had woken me, at least none that I could remember, but I felt like I'd been yanked out of sleep. My heart was pounding. I lay still, listening. Nothing. No wind. No animals. Even the creek sounded muffled, like it was farther away than before. I told myself it was just the weird sleep you get out in the woods, and rolled over. But then I heard something, a faint rustling outside the tent. A few slow, deliberate steps on the bed of pine needles and old leaves. It was too heavy to be a raccoon. Not quite heavy enough to be a bear. The steps stopped just outside the nylon wall, maybe 2 feet from where my head lay. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My skin prickled, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The steps started again, a slow circle around the tent. I reached quietly for my flashlight and waited. The steps paused again near the back of the tent. That's when I heard it. Breathing. Not deep. Not animal-like. Human. Ragged and quiet. I snapped the flashlight on and pointed it straight up, illuminating the tent from the inside. Nothing outside moved. The breathing stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting for a shadow or a shape to pass across the tent walls. But nothing came. Eventually, I must have drifted off because I woke up with the sun just cresting the trees. I stepped outside and looked around. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anyone or anything had been there. I packed up and hiked farther into the forest. I figured maybe I was just spooked from being alone. Maybe it was an animal, and I had imagined the rest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching. The second night, I made camp higher up a ridge, away from the creek. This time, I cleared the area thoroughly, setting up a few makeshift noise traps, sticks balanced on rocks, a little ring of tin cups around my tent. I didn't want to be startled again without warning. The forest seemed quieter here. Less underbrush, more open spaces between the trees. That night, I lay awake longer than I meant to, just listening. The air felt dense, like it was pressing in against the tent. Every creak of a branch or distant howl of a coyote made my heart jump. Sometime past midnight, I started to drift when I heard it again. Footsteps. Not the scamper of a deer or the thud of a bear. These were measured, careful, and slow. Coming up from the ridge, I held my breath and reached for my flashlight again. This time, I didn't turn it on. I just waited. The footsteps approached the tent, and I could hear the faintest scrape of boots on the rocky ground. Then, nothing. Silence. And then I swear on my life, I heard whispering. Not words I could understand, just breathy, unintelligible murmurs. It sounded like it was right next to the tent. Then something brushed against the fabric, just lightly. I turned the flashlight on and unzipped the flap in one motion, ready to blind whoever or whatever was there. There was nothing. No one. I swung the beam around. The noise traps were undisturbed. The cups hadn't moved. The sticks were still upright. But the air, it didn't feel right. It was freezing, colder than it had any business being in the middle of July. My breath came out in little white clouds. That was the first time I really considered turning back. But I didn't. Stupid pride or stubbornness. I told myself I'd go one more night, deeper into a site I'd marked on the map near a small glacial lake. It was a tough hike, uphill most of the way, but the lake was beautiful, surrounded by jagged cliffs and still as glass. The wind didn't reach here. It was dead quiet, not even birds. That should have been a red flag. I made camp near the water's edge and stayed busy, gathering wood, boiling lake water, writing a few pages in my journal. I didn't want to let my thoughts drift too far. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, everything went dark fast. The firelight cast long shadows behind me, and I couldn't help but keep glancing over my shoulder. I told myself I was being paranoid, until I noticed something strange about the trees. One of them looked wrong. It was standing apart from the rest, near the edge of the tree line. The silhouette was too narrow, too symmetrical. It looked more like a person standing still than a tree. I stood up, squinting. The figure didn't move. I told myself it was just a narrow tree stump catching the firelight weirdly. But the hairs on my arms were standing straight up. I threw a rock toward it. No reaction. Then I called out, "Hello?" No answer. But the shape was gone. I backed toward my tent, scanning the shadows. I didn't want to run. Running would make it worse. I doused the fire, climbed into the tent, and locked the zipper. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there for hours, gripping my knife and listening. Around 1 a.m., I heard splashing in the lake. Not a fish, not a wave. It sounded like footsteps, something wading through the water. I sat bolt upright, holding my breath. The splashing got closer, then stopped. And then, as clearly as if they were inside the tent, I heard 3 slow knocks, tap, tap, tap on the nylon. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was paralyzed. Then the voice came again, a whisper. "You're not alone." It was right outside. I lost it. I unzipped the tent, burst out with a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the site, shouting, "Who's there? What do you want?" But there was no one. The lake was still. The tree line was empty. But then I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were wet footprints leading from the lake to the tent. Bare feet, human, not mine. And they ended right where I'd been lying. That's when I broke. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. I packed up my gear in the dark, shoved it all into my pack, and started hiking out by headlamp. I didn't stop for water. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop for anything, just kept moving. By dawn, I was back at the car. I drove without looking back. When I got home, I found something strange in my pack. Stuff I hadn't packed. A small, waterlogged photo of a man standing by a lake. Old, like from the 60s or 70s. I flipped it over, nothing written on it, no name, no date. But the trees in the background were the same ones I'd camped near. I threw it away, burned my gear. I haven't camped alone since. A few weeks later, out of curiosity, I searched for stories about that area. Found a few forum posts, most ignored or mocked. One stood out. It was from a guy back in 2011 who said he'd heard whispers at night up near that same lake. Thought he was losing his mind. Swore he'd seen someone standing in the water watching his tent. The post ended with, "Whatever's up there, it's not trying to scare you. It wants you to stay." Story the end. I hadn't taken a real break in almost a year. My job at the Wildlife Photography magazine kept me either behind a desk or in the field with teams, never truly alone. The constant movement, the deadlines, the endless talking, it all wore me thin. So when I finally got a week off, I decided to take a solo trip. No assignments, no cameras, no noise, just a tent, a pack, and the stillness of the forest. That was all I wanted. I chose a place deep in the Olympic National Forest in Washington. I'd heard about a remote spot near an abandoned fire lookout, accessible only by foot and far from any well-used trail. There was no real map to it, just old ranger notes and a hand-drawn path posted in a survivalist forum. That was part of the appeal. No campsites, no families, no RVs playing music at night. Just me and the trees. I packed light but carefully. Tent, food for 5 days, water purifier, cold weather gear, flare, compass, knife, a sidearm, and a GPS. I left a route plan with my sister and told her I'd check in via satellite message every night. If I missed 2 days, she'd call it in. Standard solo safety. I didn't expect any issues, but I've done enough backcountry hiking to know preparation matters more than bravado. The hike in was beautiful. The deeper I got into the forest, the quieter it became. Birds still chirped, wind still rustled, but there was a weight to the silence, as if the forest had its own consciousness. I don't mean that in a mystical way. It's just that kind of quiet you can't get in the city. Every step sinks into moss. Every breath pulls clean air into your lungs and your thoughts stop racing. I felt more like myself after just a few miles. By the time I found the old trail leading toward the lookout ruins, it late afternoon. The structure itself was long gone and mostly just a stone base overgrown with vines and a few rotted support beams. I pitched my tent in a soft clearing maybe 30 yards down a slope from it, right beside a small stream. The place felt untouched, pristine even, like no one had camped there in decades. The first night was uneventful. I ate dehydrated chili and watched the stars. There was no moon, but the sky was clear. I wrote a little in my journal and sent my check-in message to my sister. All good. Slept like a log. The second day, I spent hiking around, exploring. I found what I assumed were animal trails deeper in the woods, and even some old rusted metal debris, maybe from the original lookout or ranger outpost. Something about it was eerie, but also fascinating. A place left to nature. By nightfall, I was exhausted and ready to sleep early. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I don't remember why at first. There wasn't a sound, not even the usual rustling or distant hoots of owls, just dead silence. Then I realized I wasn't cold anymore. In fact, it felt warm, unnaturally warm inside the tent. I pushed off my sleeping bag and noticed sweat on my chest and neck. I unzipped the flap and stepped outside. The air was cool, normal for mid-fall, but not cold. But everything around me looked strange. It wasn't the forest. The trees looked wrong. Thicker, taller, darker somehow. The stream wasn't gurgling. I stood there confused until I turned and looked back at my tent. It was gone. Not packed up, not collapsed. Just gone. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The space where it had been was empty. Bare ground. No flattened grass, no footprint depressions, no gear. Panic shot through me like electricity. I spun around, calling out. My voice sounded off, like it wasn't echoing the way it should. I started to run, toward where I thought the trail had been. I tripped. Fell hard onto what felt like concrete. I rolled and scrambled up, expecting moss or leaves on my hands. Instead, I touched stone, smooth, cold stone. Then I saw it, the fire lookout, fully intact, not in ruins. Standing tall, windows glowing from inside with a soft yellow light. I was dreaming. I had to be. I approached it slowly. Each step felt like it sank into a thicker silence. No bugs, no birds, not even my own breath. The door to the lookout was ajar. I reached out and touched it. The instant my hand made contact, I woke up in my tent. Gasping. Cold. The morning sun was just breaking through the trees. Everything was there, my gear, my bag, the stream bubbling happily. But I didn't feel rested. I felt violated, like something had pulled me out of sleep and walked me through something I wasn't supposed to see. I told myself it was just a dream, a vivid one. Maybe the elevation or the food messed with my head. I wrote it all down in my journal and tried to shake it off. But that night, things got worse. I stayed up later, not wanting to sleep. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps, not heavy, more like someone walking barefoot on damp leaves. Slow, careful. I turned off my light and listened. They circled the tent, once, twice, then stopped. I didn't move. My hand was on my knife, my heart pounding. I whispered, "Hello." No response. Then something pressed against the side of the tent. Not a hand, more like a face. I could see the outline. The pressure against the fabric. No breath, no noise. I didn't breathe. I don't know how long it stayed there, but when I blinked, it was gone, just vanished. I waited until morning, too afraid to sleep. Again, I told myself it could have been an animal, a bear or a mountain lion. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I know the way wild animals move. This was different. Day 4, I hiked out a few miles and found cell signal on a ridge. I texted my sister early, told her I was heading back a day early. I didn't say why. That night, I barely slept. The forest didn't feel welcoming anymore. It felt like it was watching me. Every snapped twig made me jump. When I finally dozed off, it was with a knife in my hand and the tent flap zipped tight. I woke up to screaming. A voice, human, just outside. "Help me, please. I need help." I shot up and scrambled outside with my flashlight. No one. The voice had come from the trees, maybe 30 feet away. I called out, "Where are you?" Silence. Then just once, the voice came again. "Help me." But this time, it didn't sound like a person. It sounded like someone trying to sound like a person. I backed into the tent and zipped it up, heart hammering in my ears. The next morning, I broke camp before sunrise and hiked out in record time. The forest felt like it was pressing in on me the whole way. I didn't stop for water. I didn't eat. I just moved. When I finally reached the gravel road where I'd parked, I almost cried. My Jeep was there, everything intact. I threw my gear in and drove. I didn't look back. Back at home, I didn't talk about it for weeks. I didn't even open the journal I'd kept until a month later. That's when I saw something I don't remember writing. A single page near the back. The handwriting was mine, but messy, like it had been scribbled in the dark. You are not alone. Below it, a crude drawing of a face pressed against tent fabric. I burned the journal that night. It's been 2 years. I haven't been back in the woods alone since. I still hike, still camp sometimes, but always with someone. And every now and then, late at night, I still hear footsteps outside my window. Story the end.